Good morning, everyone. If I can break the conversation for a moment. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the V&A. My name is Joanna Norman, and I'm Director of the V&A Research Institute, National Art Library and Archives, the hub for research programmes and partnerships across the V&A. It's a real pleasure to see so many of you here today for the Go for KOGEI 2025 Symposium. Now, before we get started, I have the enviable pleasure of doing the housekeeping. The first important thing to say is that we are not expecting a fire drill. So if you hear the fire alarm, please do follow the instructions. You can exit the auditorium by either of these doors, and members of V&A staff will be able to direct you to exit the building. So just look out for people with a pass like this. There are toilet facilities on this level and on the level below, and there is a lift through that door there if you need, should you need it. Please do ensure that phones are on silent to avoid any disruptions. You can see the programme up on the slide in front of you. There will be a light lunch provided for everybody outside on the landing. Halfway through, and we have tea and coffee available from the morning until the early afternoon, so maybe load up if you need it later. Please don't bring coffee cups or food into the auditorium. Now, I think you should all know that the programme today is mostly in English, apart from the final panel, which will be at panel 4, which will be in Japanese. If you're using a translation device, then channel 1 is English and channel 2 is Japanese. So today's symposium is part of the 5th year of the Go for KOGEI programme, an annual programme that has since 2020 involved a series of events ranging from site-specific exhibitions to academic symposia. Through its different projects, the programme aims to focus on KOGEI or crafts by engaging with global contemporary art criticism and by taking a micro-historical approach from the perspective of the Hokuriku region of Japan. Go for KOGEI was conceived by Yuji Akimoto, the International Curator of Contemporary Arts and former director of the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art in Kanazawa. And this is the first major symposium outside Japan that Go for KOGEI has organised, and it feels absolutely appropriate that the V&A should be the place to host it. This museum has a very long history of engaging with crafts practices and of thinking about craft across geographies and chronologies, and we're really pleased to be able to share some of that current work that we're doing with contemporary craft practitioners as part of today's programme. Now, inevitably, with a day like today, there are thanks due to many people, and in particular, we'd like to thank the following. Yuji Akimoto and Noetica, under the direction of Hiroshi Usui, who have produced and project managed Go for KOGEI since its inception. The not-for-profit organisation Shuto Kanazawa and the Agency for Cultural Affairs, Government of Japan and Japan Arts Council, who have provided very generous funding for today's event. And at the V&A, I'd particularly like to thank Yuko, Kikuchi and Amber Kim for leading on the organisation. So today's programme, Crafting a New Tradition Through Subversion, brings together academics, curators and practitioners in what I'm sure will be rich explorations of questions of identity, materiality, pushing boundaries and various other aspects of what we might consider crafts in Japan and beyond. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Yuko Kikuchi, Head of Academic Programmes at the V&A, to introduce our keynote speaker and indeed former colleague, Glenn Adamson. Thanks, Yuko.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Yuko Kikuchi, Head of Academic Programs at VARI. I'm going to briefly talk about this symposium itself and then also structure of today. So this symposium titled Japanese Crafts, which seems at first glance very most unconventional, focused on geography and genre-based framework on Japan, race, tradition, and crafts, However, the aim of this symposium is precisely the opposite. Here, we undo some of these fixed notions by critically engaging with contemporary craft debate. So today's program has 4 parts, starting with the keynote, Glenn Adamson. Part 1 frames critical questions in the global contemporary craft context, and also in the historical and current context of the V&A collection. In the afternoon, after lunch, Part 2 and Part 4 offer panel discussions on gender and subculture from the perspectives of 6 artists through their works. Part 3, which fits in between, will be delivered by Alberto Cavalli about the idea of contemporary artisans through the Homo Faber project. I hope you enjoy the symposium throughout the day. And so continuously, I'm going to introduce the keynote speaker, Glenn Adamson. I don't think I need to explain too much about Glenn, but he's a curator at large, Vitra Design Museum, and amazing work is published. And then also we all know about his work. And then myself and my students and then all my colleagues all benefited from his critical thinking and writing. He also almost single-handedly made into an academic field of this contemporary craft, spanning the last 3 decades. The connection between Glenn and Yuji Akimoto is also interesting to mention. The KOGEI Mirai Hai exhibition Yuji curated during his directorship at the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art, Kanazawa, in 2015, traveled to New York Museum of Arts and Design, which was then under the directorship of Glenn, as Japanese KOGEI, Future Forward exhibition. So looking back now, this was the first critical Japanese craft exhibition in recent years that engaged the regional perspective with the global debate in a dynamic way. And also, in a sense, this period anticipated the birth of Go for KOGEI. Glenn is also a predecessor of Joe Norman and contributing to the research department from 2005 to 2013. For his keynote today, he will talk about the Mingei movement in the global context to frame the critical question of Japanese crafts. So welcome, Glenn.
Thank you so much, Yuko, for that very kind introduction. And it's such a great pleasure to be back here at the V&A, my favorite place on earth. Haven't worked here since 2013, but it still feels like home. So a real pleasure to be with you this morning. What I'm going to do for you in this keynote lecture is present what I think will probably be some rather familiar touchstones of the story of craft in Japan and outside Japan in the 20th and 21st century. But what I'm going to try to do for you is give a little bit of a different context around this narrative, focusing particularly on this word unknown, which will be immediately familiar to all of you because of Suetsu Yanagi's book, The Unknown Craftsman. I'll get back to that in a minute. But the key point that I'm going to try to make for you is that the question of anonymity, which we might associate with the idea of craft as opposed to the idea of authorship, which we might associate with the idea of fine art, is itself, anonymity that is itself a tremendously significant theoretical term for understanding craft, both in its subjection, in other words, its submission or relegation to secondary status within the arts more broadly, and also anonymity can equally be a value that's used to elevate craft and in a way to position it as a transformative force in culture. So it has this kind of double role, anonymity. And what I'm going to try to do is explain that double role and also look in a kind of case study spirit at Japanese craft as a way of understanding that. So first I should say some things that I'm not talking about. So I'm focusing on the word Mingei, which, as you all know, is from Minshiteki KOGEI, so arts or crafts of the common people. This is to be distinguished from other terminology like Bijutsu Kogei, which is art crafts, Dento Kogei, traditional craft, Crafto, which this is something I actually learned from Yuko, which, as I understand it, means something like mass-produced objects made to look as if they were handmade, and is a term that was particularly popular during the period of the occupation of Japan by America after World War II, so really an export term. And then this very interesting word objet, which sort of means conceptual objects, maybe analogous to avant-garde craft that you would see coming out of America in the post-war period, or indeed Britain in the post-war period. But as I say, I'm going to be focusing on Mingei, so only one slice of this big story of Japanese craft terminology and history. And as foreshadowed, my departure point is going to be this very, very well-known book, The Unknown Craftsman, written by Yanagi, and then, as it says here on the cover, adapted by Bernard Leach. So we could think of this as a kind of joint enterprise of these two leading craft theorists. Now, if you know this book, you will remember that a kind of apex moment of the text, and really a kind of touchstone for all of Japanese craft, and certainly Mingei theory, is this bowl, the Kizamon Ido, which is a 16th century Korean tea bowl that was adopted into the Japanese tradition of Chanoyu, the tea ceremony, in subsequent centuries. And I'm just going to allow you to read with me the passage that Yanagi writes about this bowl. This may be familiar to you, but it's worth revisiting. So I'll just read it aloud. When I saw it, my heart fell. A good tea bowl, yes, but how ordinary, so simple. No more ordinary thing could be imagined. The clay had been dug from the hill at the back of the house. The glaze was made with the ash from the hearth. The potter's wheel had been irregular. The shape revealed no particular thought. It was one of many. The work had been fast, the turning was rough, done with dirty hands, the throwing slipshod, the glaze had run over the foot, the throwing room had been dark, the thrower could not read, the kiln was a wretched affair, the firing careless, sand had stuck to the pot, but nobody minded, no one invested the thing with any dreams, it is enough to make one give up working as a potter. So not very promising, but, of course there's a but, that is how it should be. The plain and unagitated, the uncalculated, the harmless, the straightforward, the natural, the innocent, the humble, the modest. Where does beauty lie if not in these qualities? So here you get the paradox of Mingei, that this object, which, as Yanagi said, is invested without dreams, is created seemingly for purely practical reasons, and crucially in an unthought manner by an illiterate person, literally in the dark, is how the greatest beauty is generated. So beauty of this kind of intensity and purity, I think would be the word, can only be created in a spirit of unthinking. And of course, we could connect this to a kind of popularization of Zen in the 20th century, and many other, I have to say, somewhat stereotypical ideas about Japan as a place where the accidental and the chance-based or aleatory take precedence over more formal and intentional aesthetics. If you know anything about Japanese art history, obviously you know that that's not always the case, but it's certainly in the reception of Japanese art abroad, and particularly in the story of Mingei, this idea of the unconsidered and the kind of magically self-appearing is absolutely central. And of course, this is related to the idea of anonymity, in the sense that if you have a known author, then that story of unthinking, of course, completely falls apart, because anonymity is precisely the means by which the lack of intention, the lack of consciousness, is secured in the object. So the minute that you have a known author, you cannot tell yourself a story about unthinkingness. And because it is from unthinkingness that true beauty evolves in Yanagi's theory, anonymity, unknownness, the unknown craftsman, is absolutely essential. Now, if you're with me so far, there's, of course, the obvious twist in the tale, which is that the Mingei practitioners and protagonists themselves were far from unknown. They were basically cosmopolitan superstars of the craft world and treated as such, and I think regarded themselves as such in some ways. So here's Kanjiro Kawai, great art, ceramic artist and graphic artist, and really, multidisciplinary figure at the heart of the Mingei movement, and also a great collector, like a lot of these people. He's well known for this phrase, "One buys things, one buys oneself," that you might have heard. So you form yourself through the process of acquisition and through the process of taste formation. We have Shoji Hamada, obviously the great potter, who cultivated a kind of accidentalism. So again, chance operations and the embrace of unplanned incident at the heart of his aesthetic. Similarly, Shiko Munakata, who's maybe more akin to a kind of self-taught artist in some regards, but a great printmaker associated with the movement. So again, a kind of folk, not unconsidered, but apparently spontaneous aesthetic, very much like what you see in Hamada's case. And then we have Leech himself. It's a very interesting slipware charger with a Javanese shadow puppet motif, who then transported this whole ideology and aesthetic here to the UK and then generated, a huge following. So thereby implanting this idea of spontaneity and the embrace of chance into British studio ceramics. Now, again, the paradox here is that these figures are all trying to adopt the standard of beauty that Yanagi is propagating in The Unknown Craftsman, but they are far from being anonymous. They have this very strong sense of authorship. It's a rather complex form of authorship that they're embodying and embracing. And I think Hamada and Munakata are really good examples of this. They're presenting themselves as masters or connoisseurs of unknownness. So they're taking that cultural content, and I'm going to use a 21st century term here, uploading it into their work as if it were an existing property that could be somehow claimed and then operationalized or instrumentalized through their own work. So a very complicated structure where you have absolutely recognized, indeed, authority-based authorship, very top-down, very cosmopolitan, very, very considered, which has at its heart this value of unthinkingness. So paradoxical, you might even say contradictory at its heart, but powerful. So much so that you have a whole range of institutions that are built around this idea, of which, of course, the most important is the Mingei-kan itself, the folk crafts museum, as you might translate it, in Tokyo, which is set up by Yanagi and the other leaders of the Mingei movement. And I'll just show you a few of the objects that are collected, just to give you a sense of how this is materialized through collecting practices. So this is the Buddhist monk Mukujiki, who is a 18th and 19th century monk who is a kind of ascetic figure. Is thought to have carved about 2,000 Buddhas over the course of his life, subsisting mainly on porridge. So, working on the grounds of a monastery in this very, very relentless way in a spiritual practice that results in these objects. So he's one of the few named figures that the Mingei group sort of pluck out of Japanese art history as an exemplar. And the fact that he has this very particular kind of practice that has to do almost with a kind of obsessive disappearance into the act of making is extremely significant, because he, while not anonymous, he perhaps embodies some of the same qualities of creativity that the Mingei theorists are valuing in other contexts, because he kind of couldn't help himself, if you see what I mean. So there's a kind of purposiveness without purpose, which is akin to the values that Yanagi is seeing in the Kazaimon bowl. But more typically, what they're collecting are these, indeed, extremely beautiful objects that have a conspicuous humility, a kind of irregularity, often certainly a quality of patina and age, and then crucially, objects that are anonymous, and also objects that are made by by ethnicities, ethnic groups that are themselves marginal within what at that time is an imperializing Japan. So you have this lacquered sake container, for example, from the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is to say present-day Okinawa. You have a carved bowl like this one by the Ainu people. I just showed you a Korean ceramic, and I'll be showing you some more in a minute. So all of these objects coming from, if you like, the periphery of Japan's sphere of influence. And again, as Yuko has, along with other scholars, has persuasively argued, Mingei must be understood as part of a kind of power play or a politics around the object, where this marginal position, which, as I say, has this idea of anonymity and unthinkingness projected onto it, is rendered in a passive position in relation to Japanese hegemony. That model, though, is exported abroad, obviously. And I'll just give you one example of that from America, which is the Mingei International Museum in San Diego, not set up until the 1970s, but very much a pure expression of the original ideas of Mingei, set up by a woman called Martha Longenecker, who was very active in traveling to Japan and collecting Japanese and Japanese American crafts. This is just a view of an installation by Christina Kim, the textile artist, with, of course, a bench by George Nakashima in front of it. And here Kim is sort of adapting the idea of boro textiles. As you can see here, this is an object from the Mingei collection, which is this, combinatory strategy of making garments and other textiles through the sewing together of scraps. So a kind of assemblage textile practice, which again has this quality of chance, an idea of necessity, a sort of urgency built into it. There's perhaps a suspicion on the part of collectors of this material, as with Yanagi's interest in the Kazaiman bowl, that this object to some extent comes out of poverty. So a necessity that's actually economic as well as creative in nature. And then you also have a broader range of collections that are brought into the world of Mingei, both in the Japanese collecting cases and also in the case of San Diego. So, for example, this kantha from the Indian subcontinent. So effectively what you have then is a situation where collecting practices, making practices, writing practices are all aligned through this idea of Mingei to construct peripheral and you might even say oppressed parts of the world and oppressed populations, and recognizes their anonymity as being a positive value, while of course keeping it intact. So that's the structure, the power structure of Mingei. And it becomes quite explicit, particularly in the case of Korea, again, drawing on the work of Yuko and other scholars here. So you have a figure like Hirobumi Ito, who was in fact the first prime minister of Japan, and then later resident general of occupied Korea, by the way, was assassinated by a Korean nationalist in 1909. But before that, he collected one of the largest groups of Koryo dynasty celadons that had ever been assembled, and then brought it back to Japan, giving objects from that collection to the imperial family, giving them to museums that can still be seen there today. So you have this kind of extraction of Korean art and craft under the guise of this kind of connoisseurial appreciation. And I'm not saying that Hirobumi Ito is affiliated directly with Mingei, but he's operating exactly at the same time in the same context, and in some ways in a similar spirit, in the sense that Korean art is here being understood as something there to be claimed, there to be taken. And this is a story that goes on, and I want to acknowledge my own position within it, I suppose, by just mentioning that the Gregory Henderson collection of Korean ceramics at the Harvard Art Museums, which was the first body of ceramics I ever studied. So when I was an undergraduate, I got to hold these things in my hand and really helped to start my whole career because I was so inspired by them. These objects were collected during and after the Korean War, and there's some controversy around Henderson's acquisition of them. Not that he would have been looting them or getting them in an illicit manner exactly, but certainly at a moment of desperation on the part of the owners of these objects. And so the fact that they're now all sitting at Harvard rather than in Seoul is considered to be somewhat controversial. And this is a story, obviously, that's happening in the 1950s. And as I say, that I myself have been involved with. Then, of course, you have the famous example of the moon jars, of which the prime example always cited is this one at the British Museum, which famously was acquired by Bernard Leach himself in an antique store in Seoul, and then ultimately given to Lucy Rhee for safekeeping, although she never took ownership of it and eventually reverted to the Leach family. And I believe it was Janet Leach that gave it to the British Museum. But in any case, you have this object, and I think this is particularly clear in this all-white picture. You have this object that almost serves as like a film screen, like an empty projection screen, onto which the artists that congregate around it can imagine anything that they like because it has a kind of blankness. And I would argue that the whiteness and the purity and the irregular geometric quality of this beautiful object, I'll just go back to it for a second. This beautiful object indeed serves as a repository for that kind of projection, exactly in the way that anonymity or supposed unthinkingness does within the story of Mingei. In other words, this is a visual or formal analog to the idea of anonymity because of its blankness. Now, obviously, we know that there are lots of other ways to understand that supposed blankness. For one thing, objects like this were very much part of a cult of Confucian philosophy during the Chosun dynasty in Korea, and far from being seen as blank, they might instead be seen as full or replete, as in the idea of a full moon, although we should recognize that these weren't called moon jars until the 20th century, so that's in some ways a modern association. But this kind of flipping back and forth between a space of absence and an assumption of presence, I think is very, very similar to what Yanagi brought to the Keizamon bowl. So again, this kind of paradoxical thing where you have the lack of authorship treated as a space in which pure beauty can arise. So absence producing ultimate presence, you could say. Now, how do we go further than simply to say that this is paradoxical? How can we position Mingei and its preoccupations within a larger encounter with the idea of the unknown? That's what I want to try to do in the middle part of this talk. And what I'm going to do now is something that I don't think has been done with Mingei before, which is to compare it to a couple of other phenomena of the interwar period, the 1920s and 30s, that at first seem wildly dissimilar and unrelated. And the first of those situations that I want to talk about is surrealism. And you might have some intuition that Mingei and surrealism have something to do with one another. They're both kind of avant-garde. Obviously, they are happening at the same time. But certainly, the Mingei practitioners did not understand themselves as surrealist in any way. And the surrealists, for their part, didn't seem to have much interest in craft. And that's not a big part of their self-description or their own self-theorization. However, the idea of unknownness obviously is strongly shared between the two. Whereas in the case of Mingei, you have a projection of unknownness onto other people. In the case of surrealism, the unknown is obviously found within, beautifully exemplified by this Magritte painting. So it's in the subconscious or the unconscious that the stimulations of uncertainty and the kind of impenetrable nature of the self is embraced as this domain, this domain that can't be fully visited, but can sort of, its contours can be somehow mapped through intuitive practices. And in this case, the sort of vivid juxtaposition of the cloudy sky with the interior of the eye. You also, very interestingly, have these collecting practices and object-based practices that actually constitute some of the formal repertoire of surrealism. So that happens in photography. Consider these images by Dora Maar and Charlotte Perriand, for example, which start to get a bit closer to the aesthetics that you see in Mingei. Or another great example, this Eileen Agar hat, which is itself a kind of collection, a sort of accumulation or again, an assemblage. and think about an object like this in relation to the borrowed textiles that I showed you, for example, earlier, this idea of a kind of happenstance arrangement or coming together of disparate things that forms itself as a new entity. And it's the way that those things talk to one another, even though they don't really belong together or didn't belong together until they were placed as such, that you also see happening in the Mingei kan. So this is a kind of museological object that uses the idea of collecting and the adventitious or chance-based opportunistic nature of collecting as a way of creating a new kind of textuality, which is not explicit, not literal, instead is very evocative or suggestive, and creating this kind of world of possibility, a very unfixed situation and for the objects that the objects then exist within. And I would argue that you can see a very strong parallel between that kind of unknownness and the kind of unknownness that we see in Mingei, even though it is, as I say, directed in and connected to the idea of the subconscious or unconscious of the surrealist him or herself, rather than the peasant mentality that Miyagi was seeing in the Kazaiman Bowl, for example. So that's one example, surrealism. What about science fiction? Another thing happening in a big way in the 1920s and 1930s. Here, for example, you have the cover of Amazing Stories, which was one of the first pulp magazines, so-called because of their pulpy, cheap paper, that was founded by Hugo Gernsback, European immigrant, but working in America. And I was very struck by the kind of weird similarity between this cover of Amazing Stories and the Magritte painting. Another staring into the eye, so another sense that you might be encountering the self. But look at the way that this particular self is being constituted. So you have a kind of procession around the rim of the eye, which has lightning bolts for lashes. And I hope you can see this, but basically it's the story of evolution. So you have dinosaurs, cavemen and cavewomen, leading ultimately to medieval knights up at the top of the eye. And then in the middle, you have gear work and submarines and spaceships. So it's basically a story of all of humanity contained within a single eye. And of course, the point of this is that it's a story about the past leading to the unknown future. So when we think about science fiction, instead of the unknown being found in other people, which is what you have in the case of Mingei, rather than being found in the self, instead it's obviously located in tomorrow, in the future itself. That's where the unknown is for the science fiction practitioner. And this becomes mainstream with extraordinary rapidity. The great example would be the 1939-40 World's Fair in New York, which has this as its centerpiece, the Trilon and Perisphere, which look almost like they were ripped off the cover of Amazing Stories or some other science fiction magazine, and is indeed, the theme of the whole fair is the world of tomorrow. Has as one of its most captivating features and central events the burying of a time capsule, which looks a little bit like a rocket or a torpedo that's inserted deep into the ground, with the idea that it won't be dug up until 5,000 years in the future, so 5939. It was meant to be excavated, and it was filled with all of these objects. So it's another museological construct, like a mini Mingei kan, you could say. Intriguingly, objects that are very much everyday. There was a little bit of product placement here. So there was a Mickey Mouse mug. There were Elizabeth Arden cosmetics, but there were also objects of everyday life. And also, interestingly, a lot of language was placed into the time capsule. There was a Bible, for example, translated into many, many languages. A lot of the text was reproduced in microfilm. And brilliantly, they included not only the microfilm, but also instructions for constructing a microfilm reader, on the theory that people in 5939 might not have one. And there was also a guide to learning English, on the theory that English itself might have fallen out of use by 5939, quite likely. So you have this object which is in some ways exactly the opposite of a Mingei craft artifact, right? It's could not be more considered. It is extremely authorial in the sense that it is funded by Westinghouse and is basically a brand exercise. And it's made of this copper alloy that's meant to be completely corrosion resistant, so it will be eternal. And most importantly, it's an object that's fully oriented towards the future rather than the past. Mingei is obviously a cult of tradition and a cult of history. This is an object that's exclusively facing towards tomorrow, deep into tomorrow. And yet at the same time, it has this collecting energy within it. It has a kind of embrace of the everyday. And also, in a very surprising way, it also has a kind of humility about it, which seems at odds with the nominal nature of the project. And what I'm thinking about here are these statements that were commissioned from various leading intellectuals of the time, including the German author Thomas Mann. And again, I'll just read this to you. This is just an excerpt from his statement. He said, "We now know that the idea of the future as a better world was a fallacy of the doctrine of progress," which is something Yanagi and Leach could have said, right? The endeavor on the part of man, apologies for the non-gender neutral language, that's the period we're in. The endeavor on the part of man is to approximate to his idea of himself, the humanization of man, another thing that Yanagi and Leach might have said. What we in this year of our Lord 1938 understand by the term culture, a notion held in small esteem today by certain nations in the Western world, is simply this endeavor. So a remarkable affinity between what Mann is saying here and what we're hearing from these craft theorists. And then this is a little bit less resonant with the rhetoric of Mingei, but I can't resist showing it to you. This is what Einstein had to say. And of course, you have to remember this is on the verge of World War II, right? We're in 1938, 1939. And he says, the production and distribution of commodities is entirely unorganized, so that everybody must live in fear of being eliminated from the economic cycle, in this way suffering for the want of everything. And what he's doing here is explaining the present to the future. So he's trying to characterize what 1938 is like to the people in 59-39. Furthermore, people living in different countries kill each other at irregular time intervals. And if that's not a scientist describing war, I don't know what is. I trust that posterity will read these statements with a feeling of proud and justified superiority. And that line to me is very, very resonant in relation to Mingei. That proud and justified superiority is in a way exactly what Leach and Yanagi were arrogating to themselves. And Einstein here is seeming to reflect on that. Now, I do have an ulterior motive for having used this slightly weird example, which is that when I was looking into this matter of anonymity, I ran across this telegram, which was sent to Westinghouse by Rose Powell, as you can see, Rose Arnold Powell, founder of the Susan B. Anthony Forum, so a feminist activist. And she had read the list of people whose statements were included in the time capsule, Thomas Mann, Einstein, the others, and noticed that there were no women on the list. And she wrote to them, as you can see, quite politely and said, how about asking Carrie Chapman Catt, who was one of the great suffragettes in America, working for the right for women to vote. And by virtue of this telegram, I now want to execute a neat pivot into the question of feminism and its relationship to anonymity. Because if you have one quote in your mind that with regard to the idea of anonymity, it probably is the line, "Anonymous was a woman," right? You've all heard that. It's actually a misquote. The original line is Virginia Woolf's from A Room of One's Own. This is what she actually wrote. I would venture to guess that Anon, who wrote so many poems without signing them, was often a woman. And throughout the story of 20th century and 21st century feminism, this question of anonymity is again absolutely central. Think of Linda Nauckland's Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, for example. So the idea that women are relegated to a position outside of secure authorship and outside of the canon, which of course is built on the structure, on this infrastructure of authorship, that is exactly the thing that feminists have always wanted to undo. And the question has often been, and maybe still is, does one embrace anonymity and essentially create within it a sense of positive presence, which in a way is the Mingei-like strategy, or instead does one contest anonymity and say, well, actually, thank you very much, there have been great women artists and great women in every other field too. And right next to Virginia Woolf, we have her sister, Vanessa Bell, and her lover, ally, Duncan Grant, creating this famous women dinner service, which was made for Kenneth Clark, the art historian, in the mid-1930s, and was relatively recently rediscovered. And now you can see it at Charleston, the house in Sussex where Bell and Grant and their circle lived and worked. And each of these plates is devoted to either a historic or contemporary woman and tries to pay them some kind of tribute. So here's the plate that's dedicated to Virginia Woolf. And again, an association that many of you will have already made, an incredible, in a way, shocking precursor to this project by Judy Chicago, who of course didn't know the famous women dinner service because it wasn't known in the 70s. But she did pretty much exactly the same thing, although in far more sculptural and ambitious form in her project, The Dinner Party, which is the kind of the kind of touchstone work of feminism from America in the 1970s, where she created these place settings, each of which were devoted to a specific woman from history, writers, religious figures, artists. And here's the Virginia Woolf plate in detail, using this so-called central core sexualized imagery as a way of trying to communicate the essential nature of women's creativity as a kind of unfolding or unflowering. So she, Judy Chicago, like Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell in their project, is trying to contest the idea of anonymity, to resist that is the fate of women, and that, in fact, women in the past must necessarily remain anonymous. And the answer they give is no. We can recover these names and attach agency to them retrospectively, and of course in the present day. On the other hand, you have feminists like Miriam Shapiro, who is a close colleague of Judy Chicago's, founded the Woman House Project in 1972 out in California, then came back to New York, who do embrace the idea of anonymity. And here you have this, again, very Borough textile-like work on the left that she actually called Anonymous as a Woman. This is an example of what she called femage, which is like collage, but by women and for women and about women. So here you have this sense that anonymity, as in the tea bowl, can be embraced as a positive value. And here we might reflect on the fact that anonymity, and the V&A is a great place to say this, that anonymity is not the exception when it comes to human creativity. It is in fact the rule. In other words, almost everything that has ever been made by creative people has remained anonymous or has become anonymous, just statistically speaking. And if you walk through the galleries here, and just ask yourself, how many authors am I being confronted with? Certainly plenty, but we go up to the ceramics gallery, many, many, many objects whose makers are unknown, and we can't get their voice except through their object. And so you might say that actually the preponderance of historical weight is on the side of the anonymous, so that the Mingei solution, the feminist solution, as exemplified by Miriam Shapiro, rather than that exemplified by Judy Chicago, that is actually where the great mass of value is within art history. And it's simply a matter of opening our eyes to that. So that's the middle of the talk. Now the end of the talk. I want to give you a sense, as promised in my title, of what the future of Mingei might look like. And for that purpose, I want to take us to this recent project, which is called Art Without Heroes, at the William Morris Gallery, which looked at Mingei in a kind of expanded field. And very importantly, drew attention to the kinds of political dynamics that I was mentioning earlier in regard to Korea. So here, for example, is another of these Mingei protagonists who I didn't mention earlier, Keisuke Sarazawa, the great printmaker. And this is a six-fold screen that he made of Okinawa, the former Ryukyu Kingdom, which at this time was an imperial possession or had become an imperial possession of Japan. And Roisin Inglesby, who's here, who is the curator of the show, has a great line about this, which is this is Roisin talking, but this could be the thesis of my talk. There is a difference between the anonymous maker and those who have been anonymized by political and social repression. In other words, anonymity, while it is this background condition for artistic practice, also can be itself considered as an operation and maybe even as a kind of performance of violence. So when you anonymize somebody, you are draining them of agency, you are removing something. It's a kind of negative act, if you like, which is exactly what Japan is doing to the Ainu, to the Okinawans, to the Koreans at this date. So this politicized understanding of anonymity, then in the 21st century, would have to be placed within the condition of what it is to be anonymous now. And here I'm thinking about a lot of commentators on digital culture who have said that we might be living through the end of anonymity, and not in a good way. Because now that we are all under surveillance, to use the modish fashionable term, and we are all present online in ways that we to some extent can, and to a very, very much larger extent cannot control, we don't get to be anonymous anymore, right? We are all captured within this regime of knowing and naming and tracking and statistical analysis. So that privacy, in the words of Julia Angwin, is becoming a luxury good. And of course, privacy is just the flip side of anonymity, right? So it's becoming less and less possible to be anonymous. And in this strange reversal of the polarity of Mingei culture, you have the idea that anonymity would be a condition to be aspired to, but not in the sense that Yamada and Leach were aspiring to anonymity, rather in a literal sense of, can I get off this grid? Can I be unknown to tech companies? Can I be unknown to the state? So that is the context in which we might see KOGEI now, at this matrix of different kinds of anonymity, this very, very rich, complex background in which different kinds of unknown, feminism, surrealism, science fiction, and then this base model of Mingei are all present at the same time. And looking back at the show that Yuko kindly mentioned in her introduction, Japanese KOGEI Future Forward, which came to the Museum of Arts and Design and was curated by Yuji Akamoto, I think that becomes a lens by which to understand the objects that were in that exhibition. I'm just going to use one example, which is Takuro Kawata's work. I'm sure many of you will know his work. But think about this tea bowl, which is a kind of giant-sized chawan, giant-sized tea bowl, in relation to the Kazaimon tea bowl that Unagi so venerated. It is anything but humble. It has this kind of swaggering Jeff Koons-like reflective surface. It refers perhaps to science fiction, particularly of an apocalyptic kind, possibly also to a kind of post-nuclear narrative, which of course would be particularly resonant in Japan. And it's within a larger kind of fantasy landscape that Kawata has generated and cultivated over the course of his career that also draws on manga and anime and other very 20th, 21st century references, and in a way binds them together with this traditional vocabulary that we would associate with chanayu, with tea ceremony. Also crucial is the fact that these objects perform online and particularly on social media. So here's Kawata's Instagram feed, which is a really good follow, so I suggest it for you. And 57.4 thousand people are following this potter, right? So this is the operation of these objects is actually not mostly in person, but is mostly through mediation. And here we might just pause to remember that while craft has a reputation for being unmediated direct experience in material form, obviously it has always been mediated, whether that's through the little magazines of the arts and crafts movement or through exhibitionary complexes or through Instagram. So craft always gets to us somehow, and the medium is the message, as Marshall McLuhan said, in the case of craft, just as it is in these other, in any kind of artistic context. So that, in other words, the idea that craft assures direct encounter with the object is largely a myth. And it's in that form of mediation that authorship and anonymity are staged. So in Kawata's case, you have an artist who's in a very strategic and ingenious way playing on the ideas of an anonymous tradition and inverting them and making them almost into a spectacle of agency, a spectacle of science fiction inflected authorship. At the other end of the spectrum, and I'm only using, for the moment, only using examples of artists who have been featured in Go for KOGEI. So just to give you a sense of the range of the project, you have the company Kakaido and the designs of Takahiro Yagi. So these tea caddies that are almost conspicuously featureless and have some of that blankness that I was talking about earlier with respect to the moon jar. Incredibly well-made objects with this kind of amazing suction quality, so that the lid almost is drawn down onto the rest of the canister when you put them together. And as you can see on the right, an object that's so pure in its geometry, so uninflected, that it almost seems like a stand-in for materiality as such, almost like a DNA strand or a kind of basic building block from which other craft could be generated. I would also associate that aesthetic with Sora Yanagi, who of course is Soetsu Yanagi's son, who is one of the great industrial designers of the post-war period in Japan. We've recently had this wonderful project, the Sora Yanagi Appreciation Society, and there's a book that's been devoted to him, edited by Michael Marriott, the designer, and Duncan Riches, which again I recommend to you. See the idea that a baseball, for example, or some of Yanagi's own work, I'll just give you the example of this tea kettle, that you could have a kind of Mingei-like value brought out of the domain of craft and into the domain of mass production. And here the thought would be that just as the Korean peasant who made, or peasants that made the Kezaimon bowl were putting more into the world than was necessary, so working out of necessity and in a state of economic pressure and urgency and perhaps poverty in their case, but giving the world more than could have possibly been expected of them might be a good way of understanding this value. And what Sora Yanagi is trying to do is exactly that, but in the domain of industrial production. And also, as you can see, not doing what Takeru Kawata arguably is doing, making a spectacle of himself in the process. In other words, making an object that might very well travel through the world as if it were anonymously made, because most people that buy it won't know who Sora Yanagi is or have ever heard his name, but still have that object to hold close. So a real spectrum there from the very, very overstated and exaggerated and kind of hypertrophized statement of authorship in the case of Kawata to these very low-key, subtle, conspicuously humble models of authorship that we see in the case of Sora Yanagi. Last two examples I want to give, again, another artist who was associated with go for KOGEI, Takahiro Kondo, great Japanese contemporary ceramist, who's particularly well known for this ginteki technique, so the silver mist glaze that beads up on the surface and becomes this sort of Warhol-like pop visual element that plays against the otherwise very materially emphatic clay of his tea bowls and other objects. So here another chawan to hold against the Kawata and the Kezaimon. I would say this one maybe sits in a middle position between those. But the reason I bring him up is actually because of this series of work, which he calls Reduction, where he casts himself and then fires the cast of his body. And of course, when you fire a ceramic, it shrinks, right? Because the water is evaporating. And so what you get is a kind of miniaturized or reduced version of him as a human presence. And the reason I think this is so interesting in relation to what I've been talking about so far is that it implies a kind of meditative, indeed Buddhist narrative around anonymity that is yet another position within this spectrum. Maybe has something to do with the surrealist idea of encountering the unconscious, but without the narrative overlay and indeed the silence and the lack of story, the lack of narrative that you experience when you're standing in front of this object is crucial. And of course, Takahiro Kondo here is known to you and is an author, but I almost want to say that he's refusing the implications of his own authorship and, as it were, trying to stage himself as if he were anonymous before your eyes by disappearing into the interiority of his consciousness. And the fact that it's called reduction and that he literally seems to be disappearing before your eyes, melting away, seems very emblematic of this position. And I'm just going to finish with an artist who's become kind of essential for me in so many different ways, and is, I think, so resonant with the story that I've been telling you, who is Toshiko Takaizu, who, I curated a show about her, co-curated a show about her that was originated by the Noguchi Museum and is now traveling the United States, and will ultimately go to Hawaii next year, where she's from. But she was born to Okinawan immigrants who left their homeland exactly at the time that the Mingei movement was just gaining steam. So just at the time that Japan was taking over the Ryukyu kingdom and transforming it into a protectorate, Takeizu's parents left and immigrated to Hawaii. She was then raised there on a farm, so you could say she was herself kind of a peasant, like the people that made the Kazaemon Bowl. But then she transformed herself into one of the great ceramic artists of the 20th century, studied at Cranbrook, taught at Cleveland Institute of Art, then ultimately settled in New Jersey, had the rest of her career there, and is particularly known for these closed forms. So this is a very early example of this. And I think this is an example that really shows her indebtedness, not just to abstract expressionism, which people will often find in her work, a kind of color field painting and gesturalism that you would also see in contemporaneous painting, but also the tradition of East Asian ink painting. Think of those famous Zen ink paintings of the circle and how similar the decoration is here. And also the idea that the pot can serve as a kind of painting in the round into which you disappear. So going into this pure field of color and abstraction, and as a way of, if you like, animating the unknown interior of these objects, which she called the dark air inside that you cannot see, which she thought of as, in a way, the true subject of her work. She would put rattles inside these objects so that when you picked them up and shook them, they would become like musical instruments or kinetic sculptures. It's an absolutely magical experience to have with these objects. And so all of these works, if you pick them up, they would make a sound, a kind of chiming, clanking, unpredictable sound that you hear and also feel in your hands, and allows you to travel imaginatively into that unseen interior of the pod. So here, again, you have the unknown as content, but in a way that's so totally different from how Yanagi understood that in the Kazaemon Bowl, and yet also absolutely in dialogue with that. And it's just amazing to think of how Takeizu held on to that idea over the whole course of her career, including in these late works, the Star Series, as they came to be called, because each of them was named after a specific celestial body. And these are objects at the scale of a person. These are 6 foot and more tall. And again, all about the inside. They're almost like Julian Stayer's recent works, if you know those, in which people are meant to be buried. And you kind of can't not think of the idea of crawling inside them and sort of living there forever, right? So they're like tomb monuments in some way, and also being named after stars, these masterworks that hurtle through space and that you sort of orbit around as if they had their own gravitational field. And so for me personally, just because I've been thinking, I guess, a lot about her, Takeizu serves as a perfect end to this story of unknownness and anonymity. Not because obviously she's anonymous, because she's not. I'm telling you all about her with her name attached, right? But rather because it shows that the relationship between the known and the unknown is a dialectic. So these are two terms that are not absolute, but are always encountered in relation to one another. As Roshin says, anonymity or anonymization, it should be understood as a verb, as an action, as something that's brought to objects and to people, not as an eternal condition, as the feminists taught us, but rather as something that can be explored, expressed, articulated, and ultimately turned into a kind of field of aesthetic investigation. And this is what Takeizu, I think, did so powerfully in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And I think it's from her example, as well as those of many of the other artists that I've talked about this morning and that we'll be hearing about for the course of the rest of the day, that we can learn from. Thank you very much. And I'll take some questions at those times, please. Any questions?
Hi, thank you very much, Glenn. That is a very fascinating talk, and then presented a big spectrum to critically question anonymity, and also contest the way we can contest the idea of anonymity in 21st century. Thank you very much. It's the program said that question answer time after Glenn's talk, but because we are overrun at the timing. So can we just move on to the two more presentations, including me and then Masami, and then just before the lunch, and we can make some question and answer time. I hope that would be all right with you. Sorry about that. So move on to my presentation. So my name is Yuko Kikuchi, again, Head of Academic Programs at VARI Nara. So I'm cosplaying a kimono. I never worn a kimono, by the way. So this is not the normality of Japanese, wearing some arts and crafts patterned kimono as for my performance. So I'll start. I have been thinking and writing about contemporary post-colonial conditions of crafts in Japan in the global context for a very long time, with particular intersectional interest and critique connecting race, gender, technique, and materiality. My concern comes from uncritically, hardly questioned concept of Japan and tradition that I've found problematic in academia and institutions. And as Paul Gilroy argues, that there is a locked-in situation of racialization of African or Black and essentialism of Afrocentrism, which reciprocally satisfies the separation and disconnection of shared modernity and global contemporaneity, or what I've been calling myself Orientalism. For the last 3 decades or so, there has been an important critical debate on contemporary craft, spearheaded by keynote speaker Glenn Adamson, who argued the idea of craft was an invention defined in a binary opposite to fine art by Eurocentric modernism, and placed into hierarchically low and marginalized state. These debates are stimulating and work to rectify the situation in Anglo-America, but they also triggered me to think about what's not discussed, that is the issue of race, where the global majority's case are intertwined with the craft debate. In the example of Japanese crafts or Japanese tradition are separated because of the ethnic marker of Japan. A racialized and genderized craft has not been challenged in the same way as the Euro-American boundary between fine art and craft is challenged. And furthermore, the officially defined notion of tradition mostly excluded women, as well as indigenous people like Ainu, 4 generations of Korean Japanese and Chinese Japanese, who are Japanese carrying Japanese colonial legacy, just like in Black British. The gender gap in Japan is serious. This year's World Economic Forum report says Japan is placed 118 among 148 countries and the worst among the G7 countries. This reflects on the Living National Treasure system. Since the start of appointment of the Living National Treasure in 1955, under the National Law for Protection of Cultural Properties, enacted in 1950, this naturally recognizes status as the highest level of prestige in the world of arts in Japan. Alongside the prestige, the master crafts artists are granted 2 million yen, US $18,500 a year, plus a lifetime pension in return for national duty to disseminate and transmit their skills to the next generation. In the main 6 categories of ceramic, lacquer, wood, metal, textiles, and dolls, no women artists have been appointed in the first 3 major categories to date. And it was a sensational surprise in 2015 when the first woman metal artist, Osumi Yukie, was awarded. Only the categories which are associated with womanly crafts had a small number of women appointments. Ishikawa Prefecture, on which I will focus later, has the second highest number of living national treasure holders after Kyoto. They are all male artists and keep a strong hold of their lineage and schools, reflecting the issues of gender gap and defining the regional tradition. It includes the context of kutani wear and the strongest persistent in lacquer genre, in which today's presenter Suzanne Ross have been trained for over 30 years, keeping her British blazing radical spirit. Therefore, I would like the symposium to be the platform for questioning the Japanese tradition by evaluating creativity for forming a new tradition with focus on kutani wear. In Japan, craft is esteemed as high art and male profession, in stark contrast to the marginalized state of crafts that is debated in contemporary Euro-America. This unique situation we see now in 21st century has been created as a result of the multiple cultural imperialisms. The new term bijutsu for fine art was officially coined at the time of Japan's attendance at the Vienna International Exhibition in 1873 and followed the European model and the idea of art history with masterpieces of fine art. Japan wrote the first official version of the art history of Japan at the time of Paris International Exhibition in 1900, first in French, then translated into Japanese. However, Japan was excluded from joining the European League in terms of fine art. Japan is the nation of decorative arts and crafts, but lacks fine art, as was argued by the British consul in Japan, Sir John Rutherford Alcock, in his seminal book, Art and Art Industries in Japan in 1878. Japonism grades for art from Japan in the late 19th century aesthetically praised Japanese exquisite skills and aesthetic sense to inspire European avant-garde arts, but this combined with racialized aesthetic primitivism. It was, after all, a one-way Eurocentric representation, and Japan's only pragmatic way to survive was by exporting crafts and decorative arts objects to suit their taste and accumulate wealth and capital. In this context, a male-centric national craft developed and continued into the post-war period of the mid-20th century. Japan's craft and institutionalization were endorsed by its former enemy, now occupier, USA, right through to the Second World War into the Cold War period. Therefore, what is defined as Japanese crafts requires critical review and overall decolonization. The intersectional approach to understanding the issue of craft by linking race and gender still remains a work in progress agenda. In ceramics today, panel 3 moderator Tanya Harrod, as well as Maura Vincentelli, argue that craft as a racialized and genderized idea has been discussed in the case of Nigerian potter Ladi Kwali and American indigenous Pueblo potter, New Mexico, Maria Martinez. They represent rare cases of individual professional women artists working in their native style of decoration, which were discovered by male white Euro-American authorities such as Michael Cardew. From these studies, we now understand how racial and gender politics operated in narrating and evaluating their work. Vincentelli also points out these politics affect evaluation of technical and decorative aspect of their work. Wheel throwing is regarded as a professional skill job for men, with the assumption that this technique makes better pots, while hand building is regarded as a non-skilled technique to be used in making domestic cooking pots for women themselves to use. Such is a primitive practice of women's work, and not only are women not good at technology, they would be unfeminine if they were to open their legs to sit on the wheel. The correlation between the idea of femininity and nature also affects the evaluation of a woman's ceramic painting, as in the case of highly praised Ladi Kwali's stylized naturalistic decoration of exotic animals such as scorpion, lizards, and crocodiles. Both the black glaze adopted by Ladiquali and the black burnishing surface made by Maria Martinez were now a new invention that addressed Euro-American customers who sought Africanness and indigenousness, and such features were even more appreciated if the color of pots matched with the maker's skin colors. Both Quali and Martinez emerged from village artisans to become star global artists, and they were fully aware of these issues as they key to survival and acquiring fame alongside financial stability. They performed, and the public demonstrations that were expected have been photographed. Their cases present important intersectional perspectives not only in connecting race and gender, but also through the idea of technology and decoration in a cultural space that is determined by power imbalance. My intention is today to connect these decolonial intersectional issues of race and gender with the current situation of Kutani wear, and also to explore alternative ways to evaluate the work of emerging women craft artists in the converging language, but not removed from specific context of Japanese porcelain and specific to Kutani wear. The history of Kutani wear starts in Kaga feudal domain in the 17th century. Kaga overlaps with the present administrative region of Ishikawa Prefecture, where Kanazawa is the capital city. This is part of Hokuriku region, which faces the Japan Sea and equidistant from Tokyo and Kyoto, with multiple historical connections with the Korean peninsula and mainland Chinese cultures. This region proclaims itself the kingdom of crafts, with its proud history and tradition of crafts that developed over 400 years under the patronage of the Maeda clan of the Kaga feudal domain, who were enthusiastic of craft diplomacy. In order to develop knowledge of advanced craft skills, cultural missions were dispatched to different regions of Japan, and the domain's craft studio compiled a famous collection called Hyakko Hisho, or 100 Crafts Comparison Collection, with over 2,000 miniature samples of craft materials and finished parts, including decorated lacquer, fabrics, wood, leather, paper, decorative metal nail head covers, furniture, and door handles, as well as stages of making and tools and techniques to help develop the domain's craft industry. The contemporary Kanazawa's UNESCO City of Craft and Folk Art designation in 2009 also boosted the city's cultural industry and tourism. And Kutani wear is one of the most important crafts in this context. Although having a sketchy and disjointed history, Kutani wear has successfully reinvented a tradition with several distinct types of wares. Old Kutani from 17th century and revived Kutani in 19th century are characterized by 4 types. The Kutani 5-color type, depicting nature and landscape in 5 colors of green, blue, purple, yellow, and red on the white background. Another type called green type is richly decorated, predominantly in green and purple colors, with an effect of oil painting, depicting natural objects to abstract, expansive patterns with no little space. The polychrome type, which is associated with Kutani Shoza's work, and the red type, which is associated with the Saida Dokai's work and modern design of Asai Ichimo's work, the main styles created by for the export wear in the late 19th century. Kutani porcelain was highly prized within the hype of Japanism. Japanese like Christopher Dresser admire the fine painting by dots and the bold and naturalistic decoration. Dresser also appreciated the rich polychrome colors described in his vocabulary: Kaga red, a full green, ultramarine, blue, and black, with the addition sometimes of a pleasant Antwerp blue, a primrose yellow, a crimson pink, Van Dyke brown, and a sort of purple madder shade. Its popularity in international exhibitions saw it becomes highly sought after as export products and object to be collected by museums throughout Euro-America. The V&A also acquired some kutani ware of these different types after the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in 1876. However, a century or so later, contemporary kutani ware is facing serious issues of sustainability. Artisans who have trained in the traditional system of male-only apprenticeships lack successors. The average age of Ishikawa's living national treasure becomes 78. The only surviving living national treasure holder in kutani ware, Yoshita Minori, is 92. Supply chains are broken, and materials and tools are no longer available, and the labor-intensive high prices raise doubts. The rigidity of tradition and reluctance to engage globally are hindrance to both marketing and radical innovation. In the Ishikawa Prefecture Kutani Ware Technical Training Institute, that was founded in 1984 by Kutani Ware Manufacturers Association, there's evidence of strong change. This institution has functioned to continue kutani tradition by training male artisans to be successor for the kutani ceramic industry. Tutors comprise regional elder artisans and living national treasure masters who teach technical skills. However, since 2000, women students gradually started to predominate the extent during the period of 2013 to 2022. 70% of graduates were female, with ages ranging from 20s to 60s from the region, all the regions of Japan. These female students come to pursue their love for painting and are not necessarily interested in the history and tradition of kutani ware, nor do they have any strong intention to be a regional artisans with the purpose of continuing the tradition that the Institute is directing. In this desperate situation, the last 5 years have seen a number of women artists featured sensationally in media under eye-catching headlines such as Kutani Modern, and as part of festival events and tours of KUTANism that introduced the contemporary kutani artist in the region. Yoshimura Mari is one example. She was drawn to Fukushima Buzan's Akae Saibyo work, micro-painting in red, which he developed in relation with the Meiji export red type works. She began her journey training at the Ishikawa Prefecture Institute and also studied with Fukushima. Yoshimura described her Akae Saibyo work as kaleidoscope in which centrifugal design spreads from the center. Design is added every day, bit by bit, as if marking the moments of one's life, but also between her available time while busy taking care of children single-handedly. She associates materials and design with her womanly body consciousness, talking of attractiveness of red pigment as blood, the curvy lines of woman's body, and sensuous red lips that touch. When, for example, one sips tea from the tea bowl. She says, I want to express womanliness in my work, but that doesn't mean beautiful woman. Rather, it's both sides of a woman, the kawaii and scary woman that merge into a real human being. Such a subjective view is well expressed in her flowery plates and in her bowls, from which multiple exaggerated pairs of red lips erotically and scarily grow. One of the panelists this afternoon and the star of KUTANism movement is Mutayoka. Muta, originally from Tokyo, trained in fine art at London's Goldsmith College. Her chance encounter with Kutani porcelain work in London transformed her life from avant-garde conceptual artist into a ceramic artist. She returned to train in traditional skills and ceramic making at Ishikawa Prefectural Institute and set up her studio nearby. Her cross-cultural background combined with strong conceptual art training forms a critical approach to her making process. Muta approaches polychrome overglaze and referencing the 5 colors of Kutani ware, but makes her original glaze by experimenting with pigments for Japanese-style painting, for transparency, as well as oil painting pigments used for Western painting, for matte flat effect to realize something like tempera with 3D animation effect of realistic movements. Similarly, she freely mixes different motifs from classical Japanese and East Asian auspicious symbols such as whale, the god of sea, Ebisu, and kirin or qilin in Chinese, but at the same time inserts realistic animals and sea creatures. She is also feminist, vocally articulates her critical opinions on gender issues. Mutayoka is not her real name, but an invention to sound racially and sexually ambiguous in a bid to avoid being typecast. Her recent works are inspired by Yanagita Kunio, a scholar pioneered in the study of Japanese folklore and myth, and his writing of Tono Monogatari, or The Tale of Tono, and in particular Yama no Jinsei, or Life of Mountain, published in 1910. She is particularly interested in Yamamba, or Yamauba, the female mountain hag, as women who ventured deep into the mountain and either become lunatic after bearing a baby, or is stolen and kidnapped by a mountain god, or becomes abandoned in the mountain because of old age. This folklore is infused with misogyny, violence, spirituality, and mythology. Women typically have long hair, are half human and non-human, suddenly appear from deep within the mountain, screaming and crying in piercingly loud voices, ranging from young and beautiful who seduce to old, scary, ghost-like figures that haunt. Her large-scale vessel depicts her Yamamba as hybrid human and animal creatures with bodies and face that appear as part of rocks and trees. Some have a kawaii face, others are old and scary with ugly beast feet, and bodies are tangled with tree leaves. The Hokuriku region's indigenous regions, rituals and spirituality form the past and surrounds her present reality, and also nurtures her creative idiom. Muta's creative practice reminds us of the idea of conjure feminism, proposed by a scholar of African American literature scholar Camilla Martin. Martin argues Black feminist voodoo aesthetics is conjuring up image of witchcraft voodoo operated by Black priestess healers rooted in folklore. It is a reinterpretation of the images and ideas represented by the colonizers and disseminated through popular culture. But this conjuring has a subjective and subversive strategy taken by the contemporary diaspora generation. Voodoo from the past also provides a present subjective idiom for magic and power, and opens up to connect Pan-African culture with feminist solidarity. Muta's selection of mountain women and use of folklore can also be understood as her way of conjuring up feminism in the context of Japan and Kutani ware. Traditionally, the key characteristic of Kutani ware consisted of rich painting and decoration, and painters are always accorded the highest status. Both Yoshimura and Muta follow this tradition by placing the most weight in painting skills, and that is the quality by which their work is highly valued. However, their unique ideas of painting underpin their integral and undifferentiated perception of surface, body, and the haptic senses, which reflect their identity and contemporary reality. For Muta, hand-building technique is a crucial part of artistic expression. She intentionally deconstructs the traditionally refined beauty of porcelain art, and through hand-building, she revives the raw quality of material to make painting real and to drive the audience's eyes and heart to move along the curves and the uneven body surface. Muta's concept of touchable painting stresses the inseparable physical quality of painting from these organic three-dimensional bodies. It is a deconstructed and subjectively reconstructed concept of surface and decoration. The surface she paints has a tactile body when it functions to serve food. For example, the act of sipping from the painted surface of cup gives rise to an experience that brings object and human together through smell, taste, touch, and visual sensation. Therefore, surface is important, acting as a powerful catalysis to connect her painting with the audience by emotionally and physically moving them. Muta also articulates that this is her clear intention to deconstruct the hierarchy of Western fine art. In the history of Western art history, surface has been undermined and relegated to mere decoration in the modernist construction of the idea of decorative art and crafts. They are regarded as unintellectual tasks and are placed in hierarchical binary opposite to fine art. However, the serious way in which Yoshimura and Muta treat surface as part of their expression, adopting technique accordingly, challenges normative values and opens up an alternative way of evaluating surface and decoration. Recently, some scholars also found in surfaces an important factor for human cognition and understanding. For example, art historian Jonathan Hay discusses the power and wholeness of the meaning of surface in Min and Qing Chinese luxury objects by bringing the idea of sensuous surface, which is both a bodily and sensory experience that determine the nature of pleasure within the human experience of decorative objects. Textile artist and cultural anthropologist Fukumoto Shigeki also proposed an interesting Japanese perspective on surface in his theory of shimi, shimi, shimiru, stained, soaked, and permeate, that derives from the Japanese profound love of surface as possessing endless depth, so as to perceive an organic whole that connects inside and outside at once. These East Asian perspectives often bring refreshing ideas that challenge the modern binary concept of surface and depth. In view of this critical re-evaluation of surface, we can find contemporary relevance, not only in the work of Yoshimura and Muta, but also in the uniqueness of their expression of surface, which comes to light from a gendered and marginalized context. The example of women leading a revolution in KUTANism offer a new approach to resolve the predicament of post-colonial and postmodern conditions of Japan's stagnated traditional crafts. The direct use of body and sensuous feeling as part of their central creative drive, their techniques such as hand building, the integral idea of surface and decoration, and the adoption of magic power of folklore demand new language and alternative ways of evaluation. Their ways of practice can also engage with and empower critique for intersectional issue of race and gender, leading to decolonization for the global majority. As mothers and housewives, their ways of working are still constrained by Japanese customs to some extent, yet they are quietly but radically changing the ways in which kutani wear has been traditionally made, both structurally and aesthetically. Empowered by their steady success, they set a powerful model and create a strong sense of hope for both women craft artists and for global feminism in craft. But not only is this a victory for women artists in Japan, their example also presents viable alternative ways forward to assure a sustainable future for Kutani wear and crafts for Japan. Thank you very much. So sorry about without any pause in this, but I think I would like to introduce the next speaker, Masami Yamada. My colleague Masami Yamada, she's a curator of Japanese art in Asia department at the V&A. And among her wide-ranging interests in contemporary studio craft of Japan, she has been researching recently lacquer and preparing the opening of contemporary lacquer display in Japan Gallery in 2026. So, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Yuko. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'd first like to thank the Go for KOGEI event organizers for bringing Go for KOGEI event to London. This is very exciting. The V&A has been collecting Japanese modern crafts since its founding in 1852. Today, the museum's Japanese art and design collection includes over 48,000 objects. One of our key areas of focus has been collecting contemporary crafts. My talk explores how Japanese craft has evolved beyond tradition through the V&A's approach to collecting and curating contemporary crafts at the museum. Within our permanent Japan Gallery, the Toshiba Gallery of Japanese Art on the ground floor, there's a dedicated section that showcases contemporary studio crafts made from a diverse range of materials, including ceramics, glass, textiles, metalwork, and lacquer. Our storage capacity is rather limited, given our already substantial existing collection, and new acquisitions cannot be made without prior fundraising. Despite these constraints, we have been able to continue expanding our collection of studio crafts each year. We are committed to making the latest crafts from Japan accessible to the widest possible audience, highlighting what is happening in Japan today through our permanent gallery displays, special exhibitions, and online database. Some of the V&A's permanent galleries organized by material also feature examples of Japanese contemporary crafts, positioning them within a broader global craft context. Room 141, the Contemporary Ceramics Gallery on the top floor, presents large-scale ceramic works in an open display format, allowing visitors to experience these pieces up close and in detail. The Contemporary Glass Gallery, which opened on the third floor in 2004, also features works by Japanese glass artists, highlighting their contribution to the global studio glass movement. Japanese metalworking techniques passed down through centuries are gaining international attention through contemporary works that reinterpret these traditions with a modern sensibility. Some of these pieces are currently on display in the silver and metalware galleries as part of a display devoted to global trends in contemporary metalwork. Contemporary Japanese crafts are interpreted from multiple perspectives at the V&A, not only within the framework of Japanese arts and culture, but also in the broader context of an increasingly international craft community. Contemporary collecting itself is not a recent development at the V&A. This approach has been central to the museum's educational mission to inspire today's makers since its very beginning. The V&A was established using profits from ticket sales to the Great Exhibition of 1851, held at the Crystal Palace in London. This landmark event, the first World Fair in history, drew over 6 million visitors and was entirely devoted to showing contemporary products from around the world. Although no East Asian country officially participated, a smaller number of Japanese objects were exhibited by European art dealers. This was before Japan had fully opened to international trade, so Japanese objects were still rare and difficult to purchase. That said, Japanese objects entered the museum collection as early as 1852, the very year the V&A was founded. The first acquisitions were a group of contemporary lacquerware, which you can see here on the slide. They were purchased from William Hewitt of Hewitt & Co., a prominent London-based importer of Chinese works. Hewitt & Co. also played a leading role in presenting the China Court at the 1851 Great Exhibition. Between the 1860s and 1880s, the V&A began acquiring modern Japanese works through international exhibitions and European dealers. While we now view these objects as historic, they were originally collected as examples of Japan's latest craft practices. By the early 20th century, private collectors who had amassed significant holdings of Japanese art contributed major donations and bequests. These early acquisitions form a substantial foundation of the museum's Japanese collection today. The Far Eastern Department, now the East Asia section of V&A's Asia Department, was only established in 1970. Before then, Japanese objects were managed by material-based departments such as ceramics, metalwork, and woodwork. Curators during the early 20th century often lacked expertise in Japanese cultural context or language. Its creation, the department's creation, marked a turning point at the museum. Curators began sourcing contemporary works that combine traditional techniques with modern aesthetics, now directly from Japan and its artists, not just through European dealers. The first contemporary piece acquired after this shift was a square dish donated by Hamada Shoji in 1973, a central figure in Mingei folk craft movement and a designated living national treasure for Mingei pottery, as Glenn also mentioned in his lecture. Following the establishment of the Far Eastern Department, the V&A intensified its efforts to promote Japanese art and culture during the 1980s. Between 1980 and 1995, the museum presented 4 major exhibitions focused on Japanese art and culture. One of these Japanese ceramics today, masterworks from the Kikuchi collection, was the first to spotlight contemporary Japanese craft, specifically ceramics. This exhibition was co-organized by the Japan Foundation and Madame Tomo Kikuchi, a private collector with a strong interest in contemporary Japanese ceramics. The exhibition was first shown at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. in February 1983 and arrived at the V&A in May of the same year. In the exhibition catalogue, Madame Kikuchi explained that her aim in organizing this exhibition for overseas venues was not only to promote Japanese ceramics internationally, but also to reflect the evolving image of Japan and its craftsmanship at a time when Japan was still seen as a distant and unfamiliar country to many people in the West. Today, Madame Kikuchi's collection is housed at the Kikuchi Kanjitsu Memorial Tomo Museum in Tokyo, which is the only museum in Japan's capital devoted exclusively to modern and contemporary crafts. Japanese Ceramics Today was the first exhibition in the UK to showcase the real diversity and vitality of contemporary Japanese ceramics. Drawing from Madame Kikuchi's recent acquisitions, the exhibition featured a total of 100 living artists, including 8 women artists. Many of the artists' works were rooted in East Asian ceramic traditions. Yasuhara Miyoko, whose work is shown here on the left, is one such example, known to her expertise in Chinese-style incised celadon porcelain. At the same time, the exhibition introduced artists working outside traditional craft associations who explored new modes of expression using clay in both vessel and sculpture forms. One example is Motai Yukiko on the right, whose practice focused primarily on sculptural ceramics. In 1995, the V&A held a groundbreaking exhibition titled Japanese Studio Crafts, Tradition and the Avant-Garde. Following Japanese Ceramics Today, which had taken place 12 years earlier, this was the most comprehensive exhibition of its kind ever staged in the West. This exhibition featured over 130 makers active in the fields of ceramics, glass, lacquer, woodwork, basketry, textiles, metalwork, fiber, and jewelry. To prepare for this major undertaking, exhibition curator Rupert Faulkner spent 5 years acquiring key works by living artists. The exhibition marked a turning point in the development of V&A's contemporary Japanese craft collection, which has since grown into what is possibly the most extensive and significant holding of its kind outside Japan. This exhibition, which took place exactly 30 years ago, established the V&A's approach to presenting makers with different artistic aspirations and avenues for presenting their work. The Japanese government and national museums have traditionally focused on promoting the work of members of the Japan Art Crafts Association, Nihon KOGEI, particularly those designated as living national treasures by Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs. These individuals have long been recognized as leading figures in the field of contemporary Japanese studio crafts. But in the 1990s, while the Japanese studio crafts exhibition was being developed at the V&A, more and more experimental artists, many trained at leading art universities, were starting to work outside traditional frameworks. Many of these artists began actively exhibiting in commercial galleries in Tokyo during this time. The V&A's curatorial vision aimed to reflect this duality through its physical displays by showcasing the coexistence of institutionally recognized artists alongside those challenging the traditional boundaries with experimental approaches. In keeping with this holistic perspective, the Japanese studio craft exhibition was organized into 3 sections. The first section was dedicated to traditional crafts, showcasing not only artistic and technical innovation, but also Japan's institutional efforts to preserve centuries-old craft techniques. Visitors were welcomed by a stunning display of kimono, including work of Shimura Fukumi, shown here, which set the tone of the richness and refinement of Japanese craft heritage. Shimura was designated living national treasure in 1990 for her mastery of tsumugi weaving. Tsumugi is a type of silk fabric made from thread drawn from wild cocoons or the leftovers of cultivated silk production. The craft design section, which comes next, showcased outstanding examples of contemporary tableware, interior objects, and jewelry. And these works reflected the ideals of Japan's craft design movement, which emerged in the 1950s and emphasized utility and an awareness of modern lifestyles. These are a few examples from the craft design section. Recognized in the 1990s as an innovator in the field of contemporary jewelry, Ito Kazuhiro gained attention for using non-traditional materials such as cypress wood and steel wire, seen here. The final and the largest section of the exhibition was dedicated to avant-garde, showcasing bold and often large sculpture works in ceramics, lacquer, metal, and fiber that dramatically filled the gallery space. This section featured artists who actively challenged the conventions of traditional crafts movements and was the part of the exhibition that most captured the attention of the British public at the time, with many describing it as truly revelatory. Among the key works in this section, I'd like to draw your attention to the bold presence of Iwata Ruri's large glass sculpture on the right. Made from cast glass blocks, it was praised for its pure form and monumental physicality. She was able to realize such works thanks to the facilities provided by her family business, the Iwata Glass Company. The presence of a woman artist was strongly felt in the avant-garde section, particularly in the field of fiber art. Among them was Kumai Kyoko, renowned for her innovation and distinctive technique of weaving thin stainless steel wire to create works that evoke the intangible qualities of wind, air, and light. For the exhibition, she installed a large-scale dramatic wall piece that embodied these elements visible in the background of this photograph. 1992 marked the first time that works by Japanese women studio craft artists were acquired for the V&A collection. This milestone occurred in the lead up to the Japanese studio craft exhibition. The three acquisitions were a silk kimono by Furusawa Machiko, which combined shibori tie-dyeing techniques with hand painting. Basketry work by Sekijima Hisako, influenced by the contemporary American basketry movement during her time in New York in the 1970s. And a hammered silver vase by Osumi Yukie, who would later become the first female metalwork artist to be named a living national treasure, recognized for her mastery of metal hammering, as Yuko also mentioned in her lecture. All of these works were added to the V&A collection in 1992. In recent exhibitions and displays at the V&A, we have continued our approach of curating purposeful physical juxtapositions, bringing together works by makers working within established institutional traditions and those operating independently. This kind of cross-platform presentation is quite rare in Japan, where artists who exhibit in different contexts, such as government-sponsored craft exhibitions and commercial galleries, rarely encounter one another or engage in dialogue. A notable example of our curatorial approach can be seen in the modern and contemporary section of Kimono Kyoto Catwalk, a major exhibition curated by Anna Jackson and held at the V&A in 2020, which explored the evolution of kimono fashion from the 17th century to the present day. In this exhibition, kimono by officially recognized living national treasures such as Moriguchi Kunihiko, who specializes in Yuzen paste-resist dyeing technique, were displayed in the same gallery space as works by makers and designers operate outside conventional platforms. The three examples you see here on the screen illustrate this contrast. On the left, a piece by Hiroko Takahashi, a graduate of Tokyo University of the Arts, whose practice aims to bridge fashion and art through gender-neutral kimono design. And on the right, this is a vibrant ensemble by Ishikawa Narutoshi. His kimono brand, Iroka, is known for its bold, unconventional patterns and the use of printed polyester, which allows for more affordable pricing and broader accessibility. This curatorial approach reflected a renewed interest in kimono fashion in the 21st century and confirmed its ongoing relevance in both traditional and contemporary contexts. Today, the V&A's collection includes more than 50 works by individual women studio craft artists. And what's notable is that over half of these 50 works have been acquired in the past 15 years. So it's a very recent phenomenon. Since the 2010s, women artists working across a wide range of craft disciplines, not just in textiles or fiber art, which have historically been associated with women, women in other areas have become increasingly visible in Japan. Notably, all three women artists featured here, along with many other artists whose work has recently entered the collection, work independently outside the framework of traditional craft associations. The 2010s also marked a significant expansion of opportunities for studio craft artists in Japan in general, largely due to the reach of the internet and social media. Like their peers in other countries, Japanese artists now use platforms such as Instagram to share their work internationally, build audiences, and connect directly with collectors, curators, and fellow artists. The V&A's inclusive approach also extends to diaspora Japanese artists and to those who actively exhibit their work internationally. Their work, which engages with both Japanese and global cultural, social, and political themes, adds vital perspectives to the international craft scene. On the slide here, Kusumoto Mariko, born in Japan and based in the United States, creates jewelry using tsumami zaiku, a traditional fabric folding technique. Kusumoto's eye-catching translucent polyester and nylon creations, often inspired by natural forms, have led to collaborations with leading names in fashion and jewelry, including Jean-Paul Gaultier and Tiffany & Co. Toru Ishii in the middle, who studied in both Japan and the UK, uses traditional use and resist dyeing technique to create humorous reflections on contemporary society. This panel from the V&A collection, for example, depicts a Japanese businessman returning to Tokyo in the aftermath of Brexit. Keita Miyazaki, on the right, based between London and Tokyo, uses traditional metal casting techniques to transform used car engine parts combined with blooming paper ornaments into sculpture works. His practice responds to the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, exploring themes of fragility, resilience, and the meaning of industry progress, resonating with audiences around the world. These three works that I mentioned are currently touring North America as part of the V&A's exhibition, Japan Mystery Manga, originally curated for young V&A in East London with young audiences in mind. This exhibition explores how landscape and folklore have shaped Japan's culture, technology, and design. While the exhibits in these exhibitions are not limited to crafts and span a wide range of objects, the inclusion of contemporary works reflects the V&A's commitment to introducing today's creative practices to a broader audience across cultures and age groups. And lastly, next year, we will open a special display in the Toshiba Gallery of Japanese Art, focusing on the richness and diversity of 21st century Japanese lacquerware. This display is organized to celebrate the gallery's 40th anniversary in 2026. Among various craft mediums, lacquer has witnessed the emergence of most exciting talents in recent years. And this display will explore the development of traditional surface decoration techniques, as well as the experimentation in colors and sculpture forms. As past exhibitions have demonstrated, this new display will also feature makers with different artistic aspirations and avenues for presenting their work. In the field of shell inlay, for example, artists such as Sekino Kohei and Miyoshi Kagari developed their distinctive artistic languages, both using shell inlay through traditional apprenticeships. In contrast, Ikeda Terumasa, on the right, a rising star in recent years, works outside traditional craft associations. Trained at Kanazawa College of Art, Ikeda creates futuristic boxes covered in shell inlay with numerical motifs, combining handcrafted techniques and laser cutting technology. The emergence of highly sought-after artists like Ikeda in recent years may signal a gradual shift in Japan's craft landscape beyond traditional institutional boundaries. Lacquer has become one of the most popular mediums at Japan's major art universities in recent years, which is very interesting. While the use of traditional lacquerware has dramatically diminished in Japanese daily life over the years, a new generation of makers sees this unfamiliar yet versatile material as full of potential, offering new forms of expression. Aoki Chie, Sasai Fumie, and Matsushima Sakurako, whose works are shown on the slide, Each of them teach lacquer at Kanazawa College of Art, Kyoto City University of Arts, and Utsunomiya University, respectively. While craft professorships in Japan remain largely male-dominated, today it is encouraging to see women artists stepping into teaching roles and shaping the next generation. Their work in the V&A collection, shown here, will also be among the highlights of next year's display. The history of the V&A's contemporary Japanese craft collection reveals a field shaped by both tradition and subversion. Some makers aim to inherit and develop craft techniques within traditional framework, while others push boundaries with independent approaches. By collecting across this spectrum, we reflect how Japanese craft continues to evolve. Our curatorial approach looks beyond tradition, recognizing contemporary craft as a dynamic, global practice in the 21st century that creates space for makers from diverse backgrounds who share individual artistic aspirations to come together and shape the future of Japanese crafts together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Masami. It's already lunchtime, but I would like to take 1 or 2 questions for these 3, including keynote and 2 papers. And then if you really want to go to lunch, please go ahead. But if anybody has got burning questions for these 3 presenters, please do go ahead. Anybody?
Thank you for a fascinating morning. I'd like to ask Glenn, we've had tons of gender suddenly, but am I not correct in thinking that the whole of the Mingei tradition, all through the 20th century at least, is entirely male? I wanted to ask you about the peasant farmer's kimono. I mean, what did women get up to when they weren't cooking or tidying up? Did they not have any... Were they making baskets? Were they allowed to make kimonos? I mean, the peasant kimono you showed. Mm-hmm. Did they ever touch the wheel, touch the clay?
You mean the Boro textile kimono?
I think the textile kimono, for example. I mean, I just wondered what women got up to when they weren't being good girls.
I think Yuko might possibly be better positioned to answer this fully than I am. As both Masami and Yuko mentioned, there is a traditional association, as in many cultures, between women in certain crafts and men in certain other crafts. So textiles, and I think basketry also, as you say, tend to be more associated with female production. That said, you're also absolutely right that the Mingei, the original formation of the Mingei movement is, as far as I know, entirely male. And really, this is a major corrective that's being offered as we speak right now, today, in this conference, but also over the past 20, 30 years. So, you know, there's a larger conversation to be had here, which I think we might be having in Tanya's panel later, in fact, about the position of feminism, more broadly speaking, in Japan, and where that political transformation sits in relation to other countries. And obviously that has a big impact on the way that the arts are treated, as you saw in Yuko's statistic about living national treasures. Yuko, did you want to say anything further about that?
We can talk about it later, but yes, as Glenn says, that Mingei movement is all males movements, and then collectors and elitists are all men's, and then but the Mingei itself made many of them made by women. And women's, the life is full of these Mingei thing. And one of the person, Minagawa Masu, who's painting the mashiko pots, is the like a champion as the illiterate and anonymous woman who did great work, and 600 paintings a day she does, and so on. But the narrators are all men. Thank you. Any other question? Yes.
Wonderful presentations all, thank you. I had a question for Glenn. Fascinating and thought-provoking. I am ashamed to say I have not read The Unknown Craftsman, so that quote was new to me. And as you were talking, the idea of the maker creating it in the dark, it almost felt like the elimination of the human, that the beauty can be found through some kind of merging with nature, that it's spontaneously emerging from nature. And I just wondered what you thought about that's the pinnacle for them, is somehow when the human is eliminated.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I love the idea that everyone's going to run home tonight and read The Unknown Craftsman online.
Absolutely.
But that's a great comment and quite a beautiful image. I think what I might say is that it's the dissolution of the individual human into a shared humanity. So darkness, yes. And the reason I pulled out that particular quote was precisely because of that idea of being in the dark and illiterate. So this sense of obscurity. But I think the effort is not to so much transcend the human as we would associate in more recent theory, transhumanism, meaning a kind of merging between human agency and animal and other natural agency. I would think of it more as a kind of generic humanity. And I think one thing we didn't say in response to the first question actually is that it's very important that Mingei ideology includes not only Japan and its periphery, as I was saying, so Okinawa, Ainu culture, Korea, but also does reach into other parts of the world. And so it's part of a larger universalist project that is an important aspect of modernist philosophy, really. So you would see it in this country in relation to, for example, Clive Bell's concept of significant form, which he thinks you can see in all important artwork, whether it's intended as art, craft, design, whatever, and that it's sort of beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And so the beholder is set up in that central authority position, but there is an attempt to create a universalist account of humanity, even though it might be lurking in the dark, as you say. And I think that should be of interest to all of us, because attempts to build bridges across divides within human culture obviously are always worth considering.
Thank you.
One more question, very quick one, if there is. Otherwise, we can go to lunch. We have a light lunch provided in here and then this hallway, so please enjoy.